Ma'am, there's a locked door behind your storage shelves. What's inside? I typed back before I even thought about it. We don't have any locked rooms. My hands were shaking on the phone before I hit send. Ma'am, I can hear breathing inside, and there are 4 padlocks on the outside. I called the police, and then I sat down very slowly at my kitchen table because some quiet, buried part of me already suspected whose breath it was. 26 years of marriage, and I could not name a single door in my own house I had not opened myself. But I was about to learn that some doors are not locked to keep things out. Some are locked to keep them in. My name is Margaret Hartley, and I am 69 years old. I want to tell you this story slowly, the way I lived it, because it did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way water finds a crack in a foundation, quietly, patiently, for years, until the day the whole wall gives way. I was 40 when my first husband, Daniel Doyle, died of pancreatic cancer. We had 11 good years together and 1 very bad one. And when he was gone, I raised our son, Peter, alone in a 2-bedroom house in Winston-Salem, working as a bookkeeper for 3 different small businesses just to keep the lights on. I tell you this, not for sympathy, but so you understand the woman I was before I met Robert Hartley. I was not soft. I had already buried a husband and balanced a household on a single income and put a boy through college on scholarships and sheer stubbornness. I knew what it meant to survive. I met Robert at a Rotary Club fundraiser when I was 43. He was a structural engineering consultant, recently divorced, with warm brown eyes and the kind of laugh that made a room feel safer. He courted me the old-fashioned way. Sunday drives, handwritten notes, dinners where he asked about my son before he asked about anything else. 2 years later, we married in the garden of the house we still live in a town called Cedar Hollow, 40 minutes outside Charlotte. I remember the first time he showed me that house, before it was ours, walking me through the empty rooms with his hand at the small of my back, telling me where the morning light would land in winter, where he imagined a rocking chair on the porch when we were old. I believed, standing in that empty living room, that I had found the second half of a life I thought had ended the day Daniel died. I did not know then that a man can love you with his whole chest and still build a room in the same house he never intends to show you. I want to be honest about what I gave to that marriage, because the giving matters to this story. When Robert's consulting firm nearly folded in 2009, I took the $81,000 left over from Daniel's life insurance. Money I had promised myself I would never touch, money meant for Peter's future, and I put it into Robert's business without hesitation. I did the books for that firm for 6 years without pay because we could not afford to hire anyone else. I gave up a bookkeeping clientele of my own that I had spent a decade building because Robert traveled constantly and someone needed to be the steady one at home. I never once complained because that is not the kind of woman I am. I am the kind of woman who solves problems quietly and lets the people around her sleep well at night. Daniel used to tell me, in the last months, when he knew what was coming, that my greatest strength and my greatest danger were the exact same trait. That I would carry a house on my back without ever once asking anyone to notice the weight. Someday, he told me, propped up in a hospital bed that smelled of antiseptic and the lilies I kept bringing him, though he was allergic. Somebody's going to hand you more than you should carry, Margaret, just because you never say when it's too much. Don't let them. I did not understand, at 40, what he meant. I understand it perfectly now, 29 years later, sitting in a kitchen that still smells faintly of the soup Robert bought for a brother I never knew existed. By the time I am telling you this, Robert and I had built what looked, from the outside, like a good, quiet retirement. A 4-bedroom house with a wraparound porch. A joint retirement account that I believed, until 3 weeks ago, held $410,000. A husband who traveled to Atlanta 11 or 12 times a year for what he called the Meridian account, a client relationship he had maintained, he told me, since before we married. I want you to hold on to that number. 11 or 12 trips a year for 26 years. Somewhere around 300 trips to Atlanta for a single client. I never once questioned it, because a marriage is built on the small mercy of not counting another person's hours. There were other numbers too, smaller ones, that I only understand now as pieces of the same puzzle. Robert never once forgot a single one of my birthdays in 26 years, and yet he had, apparently, forgotten to mention an entire human being who shared his face. He remembered every anniversary with a card written in his careful engineer's block letters, and yet he could not remember, across a quarter century, to tell me the truth about where Thursday mornings actually took him. I have turned those two facts over in my hands more times than I can count, trying to understand how a man holds tenderness and deception in the same set of hands without either one poisoning the other. I am still not certain I have an answer. What I did have, in those years, was a good life by every visible measure. Sunday dinners with Peter and his wife when they could make the drive down from Raleigh. A garden I kept meticulously, roses along the back fence that Robert always complimented and never once helped weed. A church congregation that knew us as the Hartleys, the couple who brought the good pound cake to potlucks, the ones who always seemed, from a pew's distance, entirely at peace. I tell you this not to make myself sound naive, though I have wondered about that too, late at night, more than once. I tell you this because I want you to understand that betrayal rarely announces itself. It sits at your table. It compliments your roses. It writes you a birthday card in a hand you would know anywhere and calls it love. The pattern started the way these things always start. Not with a scream, but with a silence you don't notice until you do. It began, I think, about 4 years ago, though I did not let myself see it as a pattern until much more recently. Small things. A padlock key on Robert's ring that I did not recognize. Silver, newer than the others, worn smooth on one edge the way a key gets when a hand reaches for it often. I asked him about it once, over coffee, in the plain, unguarded way you ask your husband of 20-some years about something as small as a key. What's this one for? He did not even look up from his newspaper. Storage shed at the old office. Place closed years ago. I keep meaning to clean it out. I said, "You should just throw it away then." He said, "I will," and he never did. And I never asked again, because a marriage teaches you which threads are worth pulling, and I had 100 other threads that year. Peter's divorce, my sister's hip surgery, a leaking roof of our own that had nothing to do with any of this. I let it go. I want you to understand that letting it go felt, at the time, like wisdom. It did not feel like looking away. It only became looking away much later, in hindsight, which is the cruelest kind of light there is. Grocery bills crept up by $40, $50 some weeks, more cans of soup and boxes of crackers than two people eating salads and grilled chicken could possibly need. I noticed it enough to mention it once, lightly, at the kitchen counter while I put away groceries Robert had picked up himself. "We're going through an awful lot of chicken noodle soup for two people who never get sick," I said, half joking. He laughed and said something about a sale at the Harris Teeter, stocking up while prices were low, and I let that go too, because 26 years of marriage builds a kind of trust that does not ask for receipts. Then there was the basement storage room, behind the garden tools and the paint cans and the sagging metal shelving unit that held our Christmas decorations that Robert had built out himself the year we moved in. "For the water heater," he said, "and because of the radon, Margaret, you don't want to be poking around down there." I believed him. Why would I not? He was an engineer. He understood houses in a way I never would, and I had never once, in 22 years, had a reason to doubt a word he told me about a wall or a pipe or a foundation. But the sounds started maybe 18 months ago. A creak in the floorboards above the garage at 2 a.m, when Robert was supposedly asleep beside me, his side of the bed still warm but empty when I reached for him. A television murmur through the heating vents on nights he claimed he'd stayed up reading in his study. Voices too low to make out words, but too rhythmic, too conversational, to be a book on tape. Once, coming home early from my sister's in Asheville, I heard what I was certain was a man's voice. Not Robert's. Lower, rougher, agitated. Coming from somewhere near the garage, and when I called out, the house went entirely silent, the particular silence of a room that has just stopped breathing on purpose, and Robert appeared at the top of the basement stairs wiping his hands on a rag, telling me he'd been fixing a leak. "I didn't hear the garage door," he said, which was strange, because I had made a point of coming in loudly, dropping my keys on the counter the way I always did. He kissed my forehead and asked about my sister's hip, and I let the moment slide past both of us like a fish slipping back into dark water, because that is what 26 years of trust does. It teaches you to let things slide. It does not teach you, until much later, that some things should never be allowed to slide at all. I want to tell you that I confronted him then. I did not. I want to tell you I am the kind of woman who demands answers the moment she smells smoke. I am not. I am the kind of woman who watches and waits and gathers, because I learned a long time ago that a question asked too early only teaches a liar how to lie better. The decision to act did not arrive as a single moment. It arrived as an accumulation. The padlock key, the soup cans, the voice in the basement, and finally, 3 weeks ago, a bank statement I opened by mistake because Robert had left his laptop unlocked on the kitchen counter while he showered. A recurring monthly transfer of $1,800 going out of our joint retirement account to an account I did not recognize, under a name I did not recognize, Thomas Hartley. Robert did not have a brother. Robert had told me, in the very first year we dated, that he was an only child, that his parents had died when he was in his 20s, that there was no one left of his family but him. I had believed that too. I sat with that bank statement for 3 days before I told a single soul, because I needed, first, to know what kind of woman I was about to become. The person I finally called was Dorothy Whitcomb, who has been my closest friend for 19 years, and who spent 30 of those years as a family court judge in Mecklenburg County before she retired. Dorothy has a mind like a filing cabinet and a heart like a furnace, and she does not tell you what you want to hear. She told me to come over that same afternoon, and I sat at her kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea going cold in front of me while I told her everything. The padlock key, the sounds, the name on the statement, the 26 years of trips to Atlanta. Dorothy listened without interrupting, which is a rarer gift than people realize. When I finished, she folded her hands on the table and said, "Margaret, I am going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer it honestly, not the way you think a good wife is supposed to answer it. Do you believe your husband is being unfaithful to you? Or do you believe he is protecting something?" I told her I did not know. She said, "Then that is the question we answer first, because it changes everything about what you do next. A man hiding a woman hides her in a hotel room, Margaret. He does not build a locked room in his own basement and pad the walls. I had not told her the walls were padded. I had only told her they were thick. She had already understood something I had not let myself understand. Whatever this is," Dorothy said, "you do not confront him blind. You confront him from a position where you cannot be hurt any further than you already have been. That is not cruelty. That is 30 years of watching what happens to women who ask questions before they've protected themselves first." I asked her, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be, "What if it's something terrible, Dorothy? What if I don't want to know?" She reached across the table and took my hand, and she said something I have repeated to myself nearly every day since. "Margaret, you already know something is terrible. You have known for months. The only question left is whether you find out on your own terms, with your feet under you, or whether it finds you standing in the kitchen with nothing in your hands but surprise. I have watched 40 years of women choose the second way because they were too polite to choose the first. Don't you be one of them." I asked her if she thought I should hire someone. A private investigator, she said, was one option, though she did not love it, because private investigators are expensive and not always discreet. And what I needed first was not proof of infidelity, but proof of where the money was actually going. "Follow the money first," she said. "The money never lies the way people do. It just waits patiently to be asked the right question." That was the moment the decision hardened into a plan. And I want you to understand that everything I did after that point, I did with a clear head and a steady hand, because Dorothy had given me the one thing I needed most: permission to be careful instead of ashamed. The plan had 3 parts, and I want to walk you through each one, because the how of it matters as much as the what. The first part was money, because money is always the first part. Dorothy referred me to an elder law attorney named Marcus Levin, a soft-spoken man in his 50s, with an office above a dry cleaner in Charlotte, who had handled 3 of her toughest cases back on the bench. I met with Marcus on a Tuesday morning while Robert believed I was at my hair appointment. I brought the bank statement. I brought the 22 years of tax returns I had kept meticulously filed in a cabinet in my sewing room because old habits from my bookkeeping years die hard. Marcus looked at the recurring transfers. $1,800 a month for at least 4 years that I could document, though he suspected, from the account's opening date, that it went back much further. And he did the arithmetic out loud so I would hear it in a stranger's voice instead of my own head. "If this has been going on since this account opened 9 years ago," he said, "that is over $190,000, Mrs. Hartley. Money that came out of an account with both of your names on it. $190,000. I want you to sit with that number the way I had to sit with it, because it is not an abstraction. It is 4 years of my grandchildren's college funds. It is the greenhouse I had wanted to build in the side yard for a decade and never once mentioned again after the 2009 crash because I told myself we could not afford it. We could have afforded it. Someone else had simply decided, without asking me, what my money was for. Marcus asked me a question that morning I have not been able to shake since. Mrs. Hartley, has your husband ever asked you to sign anything you didn't fully read? A refinance document? A beneficiary change? Anything at all? And I remembered, with a cold drop in my stomach, a Tuesday 4 years earlier when Robert had come home with paperwork from the bank, tired and rushed, telling me it was just an updated beneficiary form for the retirement account. Nothing that changed anything, just something the new advisor required. I had signed it at the kitchen counter without reading past the first page, because he was my husband, and I trusted the shape of his handwriting more than I read the words themselves. Marcus pulled the actual form 2 days later. It had, buried on page 3, authorized a linked secondary account, the one now sending $1,800 a month to Thomas Hartley. I had signed my own blindness with my own hand, and no one had forced me to. That is a particular kind of grief, discovering that the door was never even locked. I simply never thought to open it. Marcus drew up paperwork that day to protect what remained of my portion of our joint assets, moving my share of an inheritance from my mother, $46,000 I had kept separate in an individual account, into an irrevocable trust in Peter's name, safe from anything that might come next. It was not vindictive. It was armor. A woman my age does not survive a second collapse the way she survives a first. The second part of the plan was information, and for that I hired a forensic accountant named Grace Nakamura, a woman Marcus trusted, who specialized in exactly this, tracing where money goes when someone doesn't want it traced. Grace worked from copies of statements I gathered slowly over 2 weeks, careful never to take originals that Robert might notice missing, photographing pages at my kitchen table late at night after he'd gone to bed, feeling, for the first time in my life, like a woman conducting surveillance on her own marriage. What Grace found took my breath away in a way the first number had not. The transfers to Thomas Hartley did not begin 4 years ago. They began 11 years ago, under a slightly different account name. And before that, going back further than digital records easily showed, there were cash withdrawals, consistent and recurring, stretching back. Grace's best estimate, working from the address history and the pattern of activity, over 20 years. Long before I had ever met Robert Hartley at that Rotary Club dinner. There's something else. Grace told me on our second call, her voice careful in the way professionals get when they know the next sentence is going to cost you something. The Meridian account your husband mentions, the client in Atlanta he's been consulting for since before your marriage. I ran it against public business filings. There is no Meridian account, Mrs. Hartley. There never was. Meridian Structural Group dissolved in 1997, 3 years before you two married, and it was never reincorporated under that name by anyone. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, doing arithmetic I did not want to do. 300 trips, give or take, to visit a client that had not existed for the entire length of our marriage. Every single one of those trips had been to see his brother. I did not sleep the night Grace gave me that report. I lay in bed next to a man I had shared a pillow with for a quarter of a century, and I understood, for the first time, that I did not know when his other life had started, only that it had been running alongside mine the entire time, like a second set of tracks beneath a road I thought was solid ground. The third part of the plan was the one I did not fully choose. It chose me. Robert left for Atlanta on a Thursday morning, the way he always did, with his single garment bag and his laptop case, and a kiss on my forehead that I let him give me because I had learned, by then, how to keep my face still. He told me the Meridian account needed him for 3 days. I told him to drive safe. And that afternoon, because the guest bathroom sink had been draining slowly for 2 weeks, and I did not want to wait for Robert to get to it eventually, I called a plumber. Her name was Jasmine Ortiz, 29 years old, sharp-eyed, recommended by my neighbor. She traced the slow drain to a shared pipe access that ran, she explained, through the storage room in the basement. The one behind the metal shelving, the one with the door Robert had built out himself. I told her there was no door there, only a wall. She told me, gently, that there was absolutely a door, and it had 4 heavy-duty padlocks on the outside, and that she thought she should mention. Because she was a decent, careful young woman, and because something in her voice told me she had already decided this was not a normal Thursday, that she could hear breathing on the other side. I did not go down to that basement myself. I want you to know that, because it would have been so easy to become the kind of woman who breaks a door down alone in a panic, and that is not who Dorothy had helped me become in 3 weeks of careful, deliberate preparation. I called the police. I called Dorothy. I called Marcus. And then I stood in my own kitchen, in the house I had helped pay for twice over, and I waited for the truth to come up the stairs. Jasmine stayed with me while we waited, her wrench still in her hand, her face pale under the fluorescent kitchen light. "Ma'am, I'm sorry," she kept saying. "I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't unhear it." I told her she had done exactly right. I have thought of her often since, this young woman who could have shrugged, tightened a pipe, and gone on to her next job, and instead chose to trust her own ears over the easy silence of minding her business. Some strangers arrive in your life for exactly 1 hour and change the whole shape of it. 2 patrol cars came first, then a sergeant. Then, once the first officer radioed back what he'd found, an ambulance no one had asked for, but everyone suddenly needed. I stood at the top of the basement stairs with my arms crossed tight over my chest, listening to muffled voices, a crowbar working at old hinges, a long groan of metal giving way after 2 decades of never once being tested, and then a silence. And then a voice, young, startled, calling up the stairs. "Ma'am, you need to come see this. There's someone alive down here. Someone alive. Not something. Someone." I remember gripping the stair rail so hard my knuckles went white, because in the 3 days since I'd read that bank statement, some part of my mind had quietly prepared itself for the worst kind of secret a locked door in a marriage usually means. I had braced for a mistress. I had braced, in my darkest imaginings at 2 in the morning, for something violent, something criminal, something I would never be able to look at Robert again without seeing. What I had not braced for was a face. I made myself walk down those stairs on my own 2 feet, though an officer offered his arm, because whatever waited at the bottom, I was not going to meet it as a woman who needed carrying. The basement smelled. I remember distinctly of instant soup and old paperbacks and something underneath both of those, something stale and human and long undisturbed by sunlight, the smell a room takes on when it has held a life no one was ever meant to notice. What came up the stairs, an hour later, was not what I expected, and I think that is the part of this story that still keeps me awake some nights, not with fear, but with a grief I am still learning the shape of. Behind that door was a room perhaps 12 feet by 14, insulated with foam paneling that explained why no sound had ever truly carried, fitted with a bed, a small television, a bookshelf of paperback westerns, a portable toilet, and a man. A man in his early 70s, gaunt, blinking hard against light he clearly was not accustomed to, with Robert's exact jawline, Robert's exact hairline gone silver at the same angle, Robert's exact eyes. I stood at the bottom of those basement stairs and looked at a face I had never seen before that was, in every particular, my husband's face. 26 years of knowing every line around Robert's eyes, every gray hair at his temple, and here was a stranger wearing that same face like a photograph left too long in water, softer at the edges, dimmer, but unmistakably, impossibly, the same man. My knees went. One of the officers caught my elbow. I remember saying, out loud, to no one, "That's not possible," because it was the only sentence my mind could still produce. The man on the bed did not look at me the way a stranger looks at someone he does not know. He looked at me the way a person looks at a face he has only ever seen in photographs, carefully, hungrily, like he was trying to match me to some description he had been given a long time ago. "You're Margaret," he said, and his voice was rough from disuse, cracked in the middle like a road that had not been driven in years. "Robert's Margaret. He talks about you all the time." I did not know, in that moment, whether that sentence was the kindest thing anyone had ever said to me or the cruelest. His name, the officers learned within the hour from the identification Grace had already traced, and the man's own halting words, was Thomas Robert Hartley, Robert's identical twin brother. A brother the world, and me, and every official record I had ever seen, believed had died in a car accident outside Savannah 41 years ago. I will tell you what came out over the following days, pieced together from Thomas himself, from Robert's stammering confession, from a folder of decades-old documents I found later in a fireproof box in Robert's study. Because the discovery did not stop at that door. It kept unfolding, the way these things do, in layers. 41 years ago, when Robert and Thomas were 29, they had been driving home from a bar outside Savannah. Thomas was behind the wheel. There was an accident. A pedestrian, a man named Elias Ford, who did not survive. Thomas fled the scene in a panic that Robert, even now, 3 weeks later, could not fully explain to me except to say that his brother had never been well. Not really. Not since a fever in childhood the doctors back then had no name for. Something that made the world close in on him at unpredictable moments, made him certain people were hunting him, made him disappear for days at a time, even as a young man. Robert told the family Thomas had died in that same accident, driving alone and buried an empty casket, because Thomas begged him to, because Thomas was convinced. With the particular, unshakable conviction of a man whose mind worked differently than most, that he would be executed, imprisoned forever, destroyed, if anyone ever found him. And so Robert had spent 41 years hiding his own brother. First in a rented house, 2 counties over, paid for in cash under a false name Robert used only for that purpose. Then, after that landlord sold the property 11 years ago and Thomas's condition worsened to the point that leaving him alone became dangerous, Robert brought him here, into our home. Into a room he built with his own hands while I was at a bookkeeping conference in Raleigh, using a weekend I remembered clearly because I had come home to find Robert exhausted and covered in drywall dust and told him he was working too hard. I stood in that basement for a week straight. Robert told me later, his voice hollowed out in a way I had never heard from him in 26 years, measuring, insulating, running a separate vent so you'd never smell anything, never hear anything. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I'd find him somewhere better within a year. And then a year became 5, and 5 became 11. And every single day I didn't tell you felt like a smaller crime than the day before, until I couldn't remember which lie I was even protecting anymore. Protecting him or protecting myself from what you'd think of a man who buried his own brother alive in a story to save him. He told me about the 11-year-old Ford accident case, dormant now, the family long since relocated, no one left actively searching, and how a lawyer he'd consulted secretly 6 years ago. Paid in cash, no paper trail, a man Marcus later helped me identify. Had told him the statute of limitations on the original hit and run had almost certainly run out, that Thomas likely faced little real legal jeopardy even if he came forward now. Robert had known, for 6 years, that the fear keeping his brother in a locked room might no longer even be a fear grounded in fact. He kept him there anyway, because by then, the room was not just protecting Thomas from the law. It was protecting Robert from ever having to explain, to me, to Claire, to anyone, why he had lied for so long in the first place. The padlocks were not to imprison Thomas as punishment. Robert wept when he told me this, and I believe, God help me, that it was true. Thomas, in his worst episodes, would try to leave, certain that people were coming for him, and the padlocks kept him from wandering into a Cedar Hollow street in the middle of the night, believing he was being chased by police who did not exist. Robert had been managing his brother's severe, untreated mental illness alone, in secret, for 4 decades, terrified that any doctor, any hospital, any official record would surface the old case and destroy the only family member he had left. The police did not simply leave once Thomas was found breathing and alive. For 3 days, Robert sat across a table from detectives while Marcus, at my request, arranged a lawyer for him too. Because whatever I felt toward my husband in that moment, I was not going to let him face a possible false imprisonment charge without representation, not when the truth was so much more tangled than a simple crime. The detectives took statements from Thomas himself, weak but lucid on his better hours, who insisted again and again in that same rasping voice that the locks had been his own idea, born out of nights he could not trust his own mind, not to walk him into traffic. A social worker was brought in to assess him. A judge, eventually, reviewed the whole arrangement, and declined to pursue charges against Robert, noting in her ruling that the case sat in a gray country between decades of misguided caretaking and outright confinement, and that prosecuting a 71-year-old man for protecting a brother, the system had never once offered a better alternative for would serve no one, least of all Thomas. I do not know if I agree with that ruling completely, even now. But I understood, watching it unfold, that the world rarely hands you a story with a clean villain in it. Mostly it hands you frightened people who made one bad decision and then spent the rest of their lives building smaller decisions on top of it to keep the first one standing. I want to pause here and tell you honestly, this is not a simple story of a wicked man and a foolish wife. I have turned it over every night for 3 weeks trying to find the clean, simple anger that would let me hate him completely, and I cannot quite find it, not entirely. What I can find is this. Whatever love Robert felt for his brother, it was built entirely on a foundation of lying to me. 26 years of Atlanta trips that were, some of them, doctor's appointments and medication runs and desperate late-night drives when Thomas's episodes grew violent. $190,000 of our shared money spent without my knowledge or consent on a secret I had every right to help carry, or at the very least, every right to know I was living beside. That is the distinction that matters to me, and I want it to matter to you too, whoever you are listening to this in your car or your kitchen tonight. It was never really about the money, though the money is real and I do not excuse it. It was about the not knowing. 26 years of sleeping beside a man and not knowing there was a brother. A room, a decades-old death, an entire second life running under the floorboards of the only life I thought we shared. The countermove I had already made, the trust, the separate accounts, Marcus's paperwork, was finished 3 days before the plumber ever called. I want to be clear about that, because I did not act out of panic once the door opened. I acted out of the plan I had already built while I still did not know what was behind it. That is the piece of this I am proudest of. I protected myself before I knew what I was protecting myself from, because a woman who waits to be certain of the wound before she stops the bleeding is a woman who bleeds longer than she needs to. The reveal, the real one, the one where I stopped watching and started speaking, happened 6 days after the police first came, in my own living room, on a Sunday afternoon I had arranged deliberately. I asked Robert to be there. I asked my son Peter to drive down from Raleigh. And I asked Robert's daughter from his first marriage, Claire, a woman I had a complicated, distant relationship with for 2 decades, to come as well. Because whatever this family was going to become, I was not going to let it be decided in whispers. I chose the dining room on purpose, not the living room sofas where we usually sat with coffee and easy conversation. A dining table has a head to it, a place where a person sits when she intends to be heard in full sentences rather than interrupted in comfortable ones. I set out water glasses for everyone because Dorothy had told me once that people listen better when their hands have something to hold, and I had learned, over 3 weeks, to trust every piece of advice that woman gave me. Robert came in from the kitchen looking like a man walking into a courtroom rather than his own dining room, and in a sense, I suppose, he was. I sat at the head of my own dining table, which I do not think I had ever done in 26 years of marriage, and I laid out, calmly, everything I knew. The bank statement, Grace's forensic report, the trust Marcus had drawn. Thomas's transfer, 3 days earlier, into a licensed psychiatric care facility in Charlotte with a legal team Marcus had helped arrange to address the old accident case, honestly, decades late, but honestly, with lawyers instead of secrecy. I am not here to destroy you, Robert, I told him, and my voice did not shake, which surprised me more than it surprised anyone else at that table. I am here to tell you what I know, what I have done, and what happens next. You will not make another decision about our money without my signature and my knowledge, ever again, for as long as we are married. Thomas will be cared for properly, by people trained to care for him, and you will visit him as often as you like, and I will not stop you. Because whatever else is true, I do not believe you are a cruel man. I believe you are a frightened one who has been frightened for 41 years and never let anyone carry it with you. But I will not be a woman who finds out about her own life by accident through a plumber ever again. Robert wept at that table the way I had never seen him weep, not even at his own mother's funeral. He said, "I was afraid if I told you, you would leave. I was afraid if I told anyone, they would take him away and lock him somewhere far worse than that room ever was. I told him I understood the fear. I told him understanding the fear did not erase what the fear had cost me. Peter, my son, sat beside me the entire time with his hand over mine, and when Robert finished speaking, Peter said only, "You should have told her, Robert." Whatever your reasons were, 26 years is not a secret. It's a second marriage you never told her she was in. I have never been prouder of my boy than I was in that moment. Later, walking me to my car, he told me quietly that he'd looked up elder financial abuse statutes on the drive down, just in case, because he wasn't going to let anyone, including his own stepfather, decide what protecting his mother looked like. That is the kind of son 11 years of scholarship applications and single-parent suppers raises. I do not take it for granted. Claire broke differently. She had known nothing either. Robert had kept this from his own daughter as completely as he had kept it from me. And I watched something crumble behind her eyes as she realized her father had built an entire hidden architecture of grief and fear that neither of his children nor his wife had ever been trusted to help him hold. At first, she defended him, the way children of complicated fathers often do out of reflex before thought. "He was trying to protect Uncle Thomas," she said. "You're making him sound like a monster." I told her gently that I was not calling her father a monster, only a man who had confused protecting someone with hiding them, which are not the same act, even when they look identical from the inside. She left the table for nearly 20 minutes, and when she came back, her eyes red. Something in her had shifted. She said only, "I had an uncle. I had an uncle my whole life, and nobody let me have him." That sentence has stayed with me more than almost anything else that day, because it told me this was never only my wound. Robert's secrecy had starved everyone who loved him of the chance to actually know him. Not just me, but his own daughter, who had grown up believing herself an only child of an only child, an entire branch of her family quietly amputated before she was ever old enough to ask why the tree looked so bare. In the weeks since, Robert and I have rebuilt something, though I will not pretend it looks like what we had before, because what we had before was, in some sense, never entirely real. We see a marriage counselor every other week, a woman named Dr. Feldman, who does not let Robert hide behind his fear the way he hid Thomas behind a locked door. She has a rule in her office I have come to love. No one is allowed to say, "I was protecting you," without finishing the sentence. Protecting you from what, specifically, and at what cost to you? Robert has had to finish that sentence more times in 6 weeks than he had in 26 years, and watching him do it, haltingly, honestly, is the closest thing to hope I have felt since that Thursday afternoon. Our finances are transparent now in a way they were never transparent for 26 years. Every account, every statement, both our names, both our eyes, a shared spreadsheet Marcus helped us set up that either of us can open at any hour of any day. Robert's monthly transfer for Thomas's care now comes out of a joint line item we agreed on together, in daylight, at our own kitchen table, instead of a shadow account neither of us named out loud. It is, strangely, a smaller number than the old one, because a licensed facility with proper billing costs less than 4 decades of secret cash arrangements and under-the-table rent. Secrecy, I have learned, is not only dishonest, it is expensive. Thomas is settled as a man in his condition can be, in a facility with real doctors and real medication and real windows that open onto real daylight. And Robert visits him twice a week. And sometimes now, so do I, because I have decided that a frightened old man who has spent 41 years hidden away deserves at least one more person willing to sit beside him and not flinch. Last month, he asked me, shyly, if I would bring him a paperback Western he'd heard about but never owned. And I did. And when I handed it to him, his hands shook. Not with fear this time, but with something closer to gratitude. It is a strange thing to find yourself building tenderness for the very secret that nearly broke your marriage. I am still learning how to hold both feelings in the same hand. I think often about the difference between a secret kept to protect someone and a secret kept to protect yourself from the consequences of the first secret. Robert began, I believe, trying to save his brother. But somewhere in 26 years, the secret stopped being about saving Thomas and started being about Robert never having to face what he had already done. The buried casket, the lie to his own parents before they died, the decades of money spent without a wife's knowledge. Fear, left alone long enough in the dark, does not stay small. It builds itself a room. It puts padlocks on the outside. And eventually it starts breathing loud enough that someone else has to be the one to hear it. If there is a piece of wisdom I want to leave you with tonight, it is this. Pay attention to the small locked doors in your own life, whatever they are. A padlock key you don't recognize, a number on a bank statement that does not add up, a silence in a room where there used to be conversation. You are not paranoid for noticing. You are not disloyal for asking. A marriage, a family, a life built on things that cannot be looked at directly is not peace. It is only quiet, and quiet is not the same thing as safe. And if you find yourself standing where I stood 3 weeks ago, staring at a locked door you did not know existed in your own home, I want you to remember what Dorothy taught me at her kitchen table. Protect yourself first. Gather what you need before you ask the question you are afraid of. You can hold compassion for the person on the other side of that door and still refuse to be the last person in the house who finds out what's inside it. Those two things are not in conflict. I have learned at 69 years old that a woman can open her arms and her eyes at the very same moment, and that is not weakness. That is, I think, the strongest thing I have ever done. I think, too, about Jasmine, the plumber who could have said nothing at all, and about how much of what finally set me free came down to one young woman who chose honesty over convenience on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. I have thought about the fact that it so often takes an outsider to say the plain thing a family has spent decades agreeing not to say. Trust the people who tell you the uncomfortable truth plainly, without softening it for your comfort. They are rarer than they should be, and they deserve to be believed the first time, not the third. I do not know, even now, whether I have fully forgiven Robert, and I have stopped pretending that forgiveness is a single door you walk through once and never think about again. Some days it feels like grace. Other days it feels like grief wearing Grace's coat. What I know for certain is that I am no longer the woman who signs a form without reading it, who lets a padlock key go unquestioned, who mistakes quiet for peace. That woman gave 26 years to a marriage without ever once asking what she was actually standing on. I do not regret those years, because the love inside them was real, even the parts built on sand. But I will never again mistake stillness in a house for the absence of a locked door. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, what would you have done in my place? And from where in the world are you listening? I read every message, and you mean more to me than you know. For more stories like this one, like this video and subscribe. There is so much more waiting for you. With love and respect. Until next time.